evening, everyone. It's just very interesting how the room just went silent when we entered. My name's Santilla Chingaipe. I'm a journalist and filmmaker and also the curator of the Not Racist But series here at the Wheeler Centre. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet this evening, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and also acknowledge any elders that might be with us this evening. For many of you that might not have come to the first season of Not Racist But, it came out of a conversation around why we don't talk enough about racism and how racism manifests itself here in Australia, and the need to interrogate that a little bit more. And season one, if you haven't listened to the podcast, I'd encourage you to find that and listen to that. Was about laying the foundation in terms of the language, but also our unique context here in Australia. And season two is kind of exploring how structural racism in many ways manifests itself, and that's why we're here today to talk about workplace racism. It's not coincidental that the return of the Not Racist But series falls on the International Day of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, or Harmony Day. That was a joke, but the Harmony Day thing. There is no harmony in racism. And you know how we dismantle racism or begin to think about dismantling racism is very much of interest, and this conversation is born out of wanting to unpack and understand the complexities of racism in Australia. It is worth acknowledging that we do have a real problem with structural racism, and today coincidentally also happens to be Close the Gap Day. Structural racism is a collective practice that exists in workplaces and in the wider society in the form of attitudes, behaviours, actions and processes. And so I've got a very distinguished panel with me tonight that's going to help me sort of navigate all of these complexities, and we will have an opportunity for you to ask questions. So, I'll get you to put your hand up when you're ready, and an usher will come to you and you can direct your question to any one of the panellists. I'll begin by introducing Dr. Jackie Huggins, who's sitting right next to me, and she is a Bidjara Birigaba Juru woman from Queensland. She's the co-chair of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. She was a national coordinator for the Aboriginal Women's Unit in 1984 and in the steering committee for the Aboriginal Women's Task Force, which produced the Women's Business Report. Sitting next to Jackie and right in the middle and is Yin Paradies, and he's a professor in Yin is an Aboriginal Asian Anglo-Australian who's chair in race relations and Indigenous knowledges and culture coordinator at Deakin University. He conducts interdisciplinary research on the health, social and economic effects of racism, as well as anti-racism theory, policy and practice across diverse settings, including government, workplaces, schools, universities, housing, the arts, museums and healthcare. And last but not least is Lee Carnie, who is a senior lawyer at the Human Rights Law Centre, advocating for equality law reform and a national charter of human rights, and the director of legal advocacy at Equality Australia, Australia's first national LGBTIQ+ legal advocacy and campaigning organisation. They're dedicated to tackling discrimination and building a movement for stronger human rights protections for all of us. Please make the panellists feel very welcome. I guess I'd like to begin the conversation by first exploring the ways in which racism manifests itself in the workplace. I'll start perhaps by thinking about the overt ways in which it manifests itself, and I'll cast your minds to last year when there was that incident where there was a telecommunications company that put out an ad requesting Anglo Saxon employers to apply for the job. Lee, just from a legal perspective, were you surprised that, they put out an ad that just wanted white candidates and no one else?
I mean, it was probably not the smartest legal decision, but I wasn't surprised that they did it. I think a lot of the time when you hear of overt racism, there's a lot of commentary where people say, I'm really surprised that that happened, but actually we shouldn't be surprised because we should know that structural discrimination exists, and the beliefs that underpin it is what allows and motivates companies to think that there are benefits for them in perpetuating racist attitudes. There's a really clear case that the very first case that the Fair Work Ombudsman decided was a case where you had two employees who were Malaysian Chinese, and they were just on a completely different employment regime to all of the Anglo Saxon workers that they worked with. So they had to record timesheets in a different way. They were underpaid almost $30,000. They were paid under a different scale to everyone else. And that's a really clear example of direct discrimination, where you can look at two people doing exactly the same thing and say, okay, well, that's a clear cut and dry type of direct discrimination. But it is the more, I guess, the less overt forms of discrimination that are much harder for the law to pick up.
And Yin, what are those less overt ways in which racism perhaps manifests itself in workplaces?
Well, it's often in the spaces between laws that it happens. So subtle cues that people use to determine whether they should interview somebody, different standards for deciding what merit is for people depending on their racial background. And often these days ideas of cultural fit are used in workplaces to include certain people and exclude others. A lot of it stems from unconscious bias, but some of it is more explicit, like the example you started us with. Yeah.
And Jackie, last year the Diversity Council of Australia did a major study looking at workplace racism, and they found that Indigenous Australians experience the highest rate of workplace racism. I think it was something like 38%. Given that Indigenous Australians are underrepresented in our population, yet overrepresented in that statistics particularly, what do you, I guess, infer when you read that sort of data, or when you hear about all these sorts of things?
Well, it points to our historical injustice, right from colonisation, where our people were put onto missions and reserves, our women sent out as domestic servants, our men as stockmen, and the way in which equal wages were not paid to many of these people. And now we have the stolen wages, which were taken off our people and put into bank accounts where that was used for infrastructure and roads and hospitals and the like right across this country. And of course now, in terms of that being carried through, it's still pretty much discriminatory as to our people suffering. It's amazing, we're always the least or the lowest population, but we have the highest representation around any social indicator in this country in terms of employment, incarceration rates, housing even. I mean, it's just off the scale. So it's not surprising at all that discrimination within the workplace, which applies to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, is still paramount. But it still goes on and is very rooted in a historical and a racialised context from colonisation.
And what are the ways in which it manifests itself for First Nations people within a workplace? Is it overt forms, as has been talked about, or does it manifest in subtle ways, or is it a combination of both?
A bit of a combination of both, I would say. I hear, I just recall people, and I know from my own experience over the years, in terms of people being held back from promotion, asking if they speak a Bung language in West End, which I received when I was a young 16-year-old working at the ABC back in Brisbane. That kind of name calling and innuendo and stereotyping, I believe, still goes on. It's probably not as overt than it was in my day. Perhaps, perhaps it still is, but there's still these low expectations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country, and that in itself is a great form of racism.
And Yin, I mean, just picking up on what Jackie said, I guess, how likely are people in the situation where they are experiencing forms of racism, particularly that subtle racism, how likely are they to report those incidences to the employers? Is it something that people are reporting, and how do they report things that aren't as obvious?
Well, we know that racism is underreported in general, and often we also know that employment contexts are one of the most common places where racism occurs. So it is very difficult to pin down subtle forms of racism and to make a case that's convincing enough to whoever would receive that in an organisation. So people are left internalising a lot of the pain and suffering and the mental health consequences of racism when it is subtle and repeated and ongoing in employment contexts without that opportunity for redress that they either feel isn't going to happen or they've seen a lack of ability to address these concerns before.
Lee, in terms of the Human Rights Law Centre and some of the work that you do, have you represented clients that have perhaps, been, have been at the receiving end of racism in the workplace? And, without sharing too much about their personal scenario, what are the sorts of things that they're bringing to you that they're seeking legal advice on?
So unfortunately, we know that there are many, many experiences of racism in the workplace. One aspect of how legal complaints are resolved is that the vast majority of complaints never get to a lawyer for assistance. In the rare cases where there is enough evidence to prove that there is being clear racist behaviour, which actually proceed to a complaint stage, most of those cases resolved by what we call settlement, which means that to receive any kind of compensation, you sign a document that says that you can't publicly talk about what happened. And so what this might mean is that in the individual case, the individual who has been turned out of their job unfairly, who has been mistreated or bullied and treated appallingly because of their race, can't advocate about what happened externally. It means that we don't get any structural, cultural change as a result of these cases. They're all dealt with. The law views them as individual instances, and part of the negotiation process, I suppose, is that there is this veil that hides them from view. And this means that when it comes to talking about them publicly, it's very difficult. A comment that I would make is that often when we think about racism in the workplace, we think about, an office worker sitting at a desk, or we think about, a construction worker on a construction site. But I think what we're seeing more and more is the pervasiveness of racism in all aspects of your work. Increasingly, our work is outside of our workplace. It's in our interactions on social media. It's being required to keep track of things online as part of our work. And it's not just an employer to an employee. It's also in the workplace in the sense that as part of your work, you are being racist in the goods and services that you're delivering. And so the culture of a workplace in terms of racist attitudes filters in all of the work that an organisation does. At the moment, one of the cases that we're involved in is the coronial inquest into the death of Tanya Day. Tanya Day was a proud Yorta Yorta woman who was sleeping on a V-Line train after an event, and she was pulled off that train by the V-Line inspectors and then charged for public drunkenness. And then she, after an injury that she sustained in the custody of the police, she died 17 days later. And the coronial inquest will look into many aspects of this case. It is that the directions hearing was this week. It was an absolutely heartbreaking experience for the family and for the community and everyone who knew her. But the point that I'm trying to make is that we cannot contain racism just within the workplace and not expect it to seep over into the actions of organisations or companies or government employees, Victoria Police, etc., that it is this incredibly pervasive thing that has an impact, this ripple effect much broader than we think.
And so, correct me if I'm wrong, if there isn't enough evidence to support the claims around racism, it's pretty much something that's not dealt with.
Effectively, and this is what happens in so many of the cases. People will come to a lawyer in the rare cases when they know that they have a right to be protected from discrimination. They seek assistance from a lawyer and they say, well, you know, we spoke on the phone, it seemed like everything was going to go really well, and then I approached in person and then they saw me and then all of a sudden I didn't get a call back. And it's very, very difficult in that situation, even though they say, I knew it because of the way that they looked at me. And if you've experienced structural discrimination, it is the cumulative impact of repeated instances of discrimination every day that mean that you understand what it looks like and mean that it is the cumulative effect of those forms of discrimination on a daily basis that lead to, the negative mental health impacts that you experience, that lead to your, effectively discrimination in a financial sense, that you don't have the same opportunities as other people have. There was a case recently that looked into this in a effectively in a goods and services sense. This was DJ Quemba, Anthony Abudo. So he is a businessman, he organises events, and he organised an event called Africa Fest. He logged it in with Paddy Mahones and they had no problem with it until 5 days before the event when they said that there's this rule that says that, I'll look up the term, but there's this rule that says that cultural events require notification to the police, even though there are a series of other events that are run which don't require that notification. And so, he'd invested substantial portions of his own funds to run this really fun, entertaining, vibrant music event for his community. And in the case, they discussed the fact that, they never actually met him face to face. So could it actually be racial discrimination if they never actually seen him? And the tribunal said, well, yes, it could, because the decision was made on the basis that he had an event called Africa Fest, and all of a sudden they had a problem with it because of who they thought might be coming and what they thought they might have to do in terms of, notifying Victoria Police about this event. And this comes down to this embedded racist idea that if it is an event called Africa Fest, then there's going to be trouble that requires the Victoria Police to come. And what's really disappointing in a lot of these cases, disappointing in a lot of these cases is that there's this veneer that it isn't about racism. We talk about it in really formal ways, official ways, but the reasoning behind it, those underlying motivating prejudicial beliefs often don't come to the surface in the way that we need to if we're serious about having these conversations.
Jackie, just following on what Lee's talked about, I mean, if you're an employee and you happen to be the only non-white person in your organisation, and you are experiencing this cumulative experience of racism, but you can't explain it because you have no evidence to prove that the way you're being treated is because of your race, what do you do?
Okay, I must say that a friend of mine and others, have said they've filled out applications and, gone for jobs, and they showed up very visibly Aboriginal, and it was said to them, we didn't know you were Aboriginal, over the phone. Now, blatant, isn't it? I have been in that predicament many a times, much younger, when I was the only Aboriginal person in the workplace. That was pretty tough. And I recall one time after that event where the guy said to me in the tea room, do you speak the Bung language over in West End? I was 16 years of age. I had him for mincemeat. The morning tea room just kind of parted. And I gave it to him. I said, how dare you speak to me in that racist tone? Who do you think you are? Look, he was an ex-Vietnam vet. Not that my father was in the military too, World War II, POW, the Thai-Burma Railway. I have nothing against soldiers, but he had that kind of gruffness about him. And I went to the... I was called in by the boss, the big boss, and he sat me down and he said, Jackie, stop being so sensitive. And that kind of thing still exists today. You know, there's young people that tell me stories about their workplaces and how they are the only Aboriginal person in the workplace. And look, if there's any employers out there and stuff, I say don't employ one black fella. You've got to employ 2 or 3, because you know there are safety in numbers. And just to put someone out there at sink or swim or sink. And thank God I swam and still continue to swim. So it's still, you know, I might talk about something that happened to me 40, 50 years ago, but it's still pervasive even now. You know, racism is such a scourge on our community. It's epidemic. We've just seen the recent events with our Muslim brothers and sisters, which we have all deplored in terms of being outraged by what has happened on the basis of your race. You get killed? Yeah, I know that scenario very well in the history of our country. It is brutal. You know, it is something that none of us should ever put up with. And, you know, it sort of pains me when I see white commentators on the morning shows, you know who I mean, who say, oh, that wasn't racist, you know. But, yes, it was racist. Don't you tell me from your dominant position about racism. You would never know what it is to walk a day in my shoes, because we know racism, people of colour, people who are different, religions, faiths, and you know, ideologies as well. So that really gripes me when a white middle-class, upper-class man or woman can actually say that piece wasn't really racist. You know, well, where are they coming from? Yeah.
Yin, just touching on what Jackie said, the toll of racism, and you've looked at the mental health aspect and the impact that has on people of colour and Indigenous Australians. I guess if you could just talk a little bit more on that and on what your research has found in terms of that impact.
Well, there's a lot of research worldwide now looking at how racism impacts on individuals and organisations and societies, and some of that is from Australia. And we know that racism against Aboriginal people, other minority groups in Australian society is most strongly linked to things like depression and anxiety, mental health outcomes, but also quite a bit of work on physical health outcomes, so impacts of racism on cardiovascular disease risk, those sorts of things. We had a recent study in Victoria using data from the Population Health Survey, which found that racism was more damaging to the health of Aboriginal Victorians than smoking. And smoking is still a big problem in Aboriginal communities. So, and more than that, I mean, looking beyond individuals, there's work on racism in organisations that has found the impacts on people who even just witness racism happening within workplaces is actually quite damaging to their mental health as well. So it has ripple effects beyond just a single interaction to those who witness it, the broader impacts on that organisation's culture and throughout societies as well.
Lee, I want to go back to something that you touched on before in terms of the processes that are currently in place and this conversation around subtle racism that manifests itself. And I guess, you know, if you are an employee in that scenario, what are your options, if any, if, as you say, there is no sort of legal avenue that you can take that down?
It gets really difficult. I remember when I was growing up, my mum used to always complain. My mum's Malaysian Chinese, and she used to come back from the office and she would say, all the white men at her work, they would go out for lunch and they wouldn't invite her. And when she brought her own food, they would make comments about what she would eat, but they would just go out for lunch and not invite her, and she'd always be like, okay, I'm just going to invite myself. I'm just going to invite myself. But, this kind of, it was a boys' club, but it was also, they didn't see any racial element to what they were doing. They just thought, well, we get along, it's a cultural fit issue, but it was something that was really, I saw as I was growing up, was just having such a drastic impact on her ability to concentrate at work, on her ability to feel like she was valued, like her voice was heard, like she was included, like she could make a contribution, but she never complained, because she felt like if she complained, it would make it worse for herself. And if she complained, then she would never fit in, she wouldn't be recognised on her own merits. And I think we've spoken a lot about this over the intervening periods, that there is always things that you can do, but so much of it is about what structures are in place that enable you to do it. There's only, I think a lot of the time, the onus is put on the individual person who's experiencing racism to fight every step of the way to do it. And that's exhausting. It shouldn't always be the one person of colour in the organisation who has to push every single change, who has to develop every policy, who has to speak up every time, who has to force their way through every single barrier that is erected in their place, that others don't have to face and can't even see. I think a lot of the time when we're talking about these issues, there's a lot of discussion about, well, what can I do? As an ally, as a white person working in an organisation that wants to make a difference, what can I do? And part of it is to make sure that you are actually carrying some of the emotional labour and the work of actually creating change, rather than assuming that it's other people's work to do. But unfortunately, in those cases, if there aren't legal avenues, if you have a really incredibly best practice supportive workplace, hopefully there has been education and training in place, everyone knows about unconscious bias, everyone is being really self-reflective, it's a diverse workplace so that you have opportunities to speak out. And then when you do report something, when you do make a complaint, it's taken seriously. There are actually consequences for racist behaviour in the workplace, and all of those send signals that we do not tolerate racism here. Because a lot of the time, if you do take it to your manager, for example, what we hear is people saying, I took it to my manager, but they said, you're being oversensitive, it's not that serious, can't we just all get along? I don't know if it's so serious we can escalate it at this stage. Here's the process for you to make a bullying complaint. Do you really think it's bullying? It was only one time. So all of these statements which minimise the impact of this behaviour mean that in the future people think, well, it's too hard, nothing's going to happen if I make a complaint anyway, so why would I stick my neck out in that situation where all of the negative consequences could just end up coming back to me.
Jackie, today's Harmony Day. It's supposed to be the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. That's the actual day that we're supposed to be observing. But Harmony Day is this day that workplaces have taken, and they invite people from different backgrounds to bring in a plate of food and talk about their culture and all that sort of stuff. And there's some workplaces that are enacting reconciliation action plans. Is that enough in terms of having this sort of conversation, in terms of understanding the impact of workplace racism? Is it enough to just share food and talk?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Because I have before me the 2018 Australian Reconciliation Barometer report.
Right.
And I just want to just quickly point out some statistics. This was a survey, a national survey that was taken of 497 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and about 1,995 other Australians in the general community. And what they said was that they think because of the education and we're moving down the track, that actually race relations is getting better for us as Indigenous Australians than ever before. But they've also, just here, which I think is quite questionable really, they said racism, both perceived and experienced, has decreased slightly. I don't know about that, I don't know about it in terms of our experience, but certainly something's got to be said for the reconciliation process, of which I've been involved with for many years. And yes, we've always had to do the hard work on it from our end. But generally, 70% of Australians in the general community believe that Australia is better off with cultural groups. There are 5 dimensions of reconciliation, which I won't go into. But more Australians now believe that it is possible to become united. 74% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people agree on that proposition, and 72% of Australians. So it kind of goes on, and there's even a perception there that some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have experienced racism, which they think has been reduced in the last 20 months. I don't know, 12 months actually. I don't know that, these figures are fairly fluid, I would say. But what really I need to point out is that until we get truth and justice in this country, and we follow the principles of the Statement from the Heart from Uluru, we're not going to change the whole core. We can go on doing our stuff, but unless we get the relationship right between everyone else and First Nations peoples in this country, it will not change. And I'm a great advocate for the Truth and Justice Commission or something of that effect. That has to be the next reiteration within the next couple of years, because we as Australians all need to know that stuff. Otherwise, we're still mucking around the edges with each other. We're kind of crossing the road, and we're not really having that full, sophisticated dialogue and conversation that needs to be had in this country. Other countries have been much better at it, Not Australia, we're still stuck there.
Do you have examples of the countries that are doing a better job?
Yeah, I think Canada is attempting to change that dialogue. Sami people in the Indigenous populations in Norway, Sweden and the Scandinavian countries are doing something. New Zealand, New Zealand, case in point, in terms of the terrible tragedy that's happened to them now, but, the incredible, the way people speak the Maori language, and I know there's 300 languages here, which one would you speak? But, Maori is the one unifying language over there that Pākehā and Maori speak. But, I was moved to tears when those young boys, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, got up and did the haka at the mosque. I was just so moved to tears. I think, why can't this happen in this country? Why can't we see it here? And I long for the day that will happen. One of my dreams come true is that as a child, I wanted history and culture taught in school. Well, I've seen that realised, and I see that is there now. But gee, I want to see this country move on in a much better way than it has in the past.
Yin, you touched on the toll that racism has on the employee, and I'm curious about what impact it has on the employer, the organisation, in terms of productivity. What effect does that have?
Well, what we do know is that cultural diversity is good for organisations in relation to, as you said, productivity, creativity, innovation. There's a certain diversity of ideas and skills and ways of thinking and being and doing that come into organisations with a mix of people from different racial, ethnic, religious backgrounds. But it doesn't work when racism is present, so those benefits of diversity are frustrated by racist cultures and environments within those organisations. So the benefits are taken away, and then of course there's the kind of conflict and stress and anxiety and impacts on mental health and physical health that reduce individual abilities of individuals to be, as we talked about, be trusted, feel included, feel respected, feel that they are welcome and as a contributing member of that organisation. So you take away the benefits of the diversity, you also produce those negative impacts from the stress of racism. Yeah.
And Lee, just taking into consideration what Jackie talked about in terms of the fact that we are yet to acknowledge the original sin and reconcile all of that, clearly from what all three of you have talked about today is that there's obviously a need for a shift in not just attitudes but culture and policy. The Victorian government trialled sort of blind recruitment where, people didn't, because there were a lot of reports of people that had non-Anglo sounding names being rejected during the interview process. And so they tried a process of where that wasn't a factor to see what kind of outcomes that would have. And in many ways, it was quite a positive trial. Do you think something like that is perhaps one way of thinking about how we can begin to address these sorts of discrepancies?
Absolutely. I think it's one piece of the puzzle. It is definitely a starting point to get us thinking about it. But once you get your foot in the door, then some of these issues can start to be fixed. And I think it's really telling that they did the trial. I'd said, actually, it does make a difference what your name sounds like and therefore what ethnicity or racial background people think you have, and then the assumptions that they make that you, even if they just change the name, they've done research on this, if you change the name to have different sounding names but exactly the same CV, just kind of rejuggled, that you're more likely to get an interview if you have an Anglo Saxon name than if you have a name that people identify as being from a non-Anglo background. If it works, you should keep doing it. There's lots of other things that you have to do as well, but I think as a starting point, it's a really sound way forward. I've been thinking about this discussion as we've been having it. I'm just going to ask a question of the audience. But often when we think about these things, people will think about racism in different ways. So some people say it's all about the individual. So for example, if you have a work context where someone makes a decision about an employment situation, some people say, well, that's one bad egg. It's just about the individual. Some people say it's about the culture in that workplace. It's about, within that workplace, the cultural decisions that would make from the people in that workplace. Then there's the people that say, well, actually, it's a broader structural issue about the sector, in this case, work. So the fact that when it comes to employment, it's all about productivity and finding the kind of best productivity fit for that organisation. And then the final way to think about it is at a society level, that all of the systems that we have work together to ensure that effectively, and I think we can't forget that a racist system benefits certain people within our society more broadly. So and I know that it's a combination of all four, but if you had to pick one of those four issues as the one which you think is the biggest contributing factor to racism in employment context, how many of you would pick the individual as the problem? Or culture? How many people think that culture is the main thing at stake? A few people. What about kind of the workplace, kind of the capitalist work system? Okay, and what about the structural, like the society that we have? There we go. And I think just getting to that point is part of the struggle in the first place, because if you really fundamentally believe that it is just one bad egg, you will never get to change those deeper structures in place. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It's very...
And I think the issue around, how your name sounds, or from backgrounds and so forth, particularly African or Muslim people, with a name like Jackie Huggins, Anglo. I know that when I go overseas, people say, "Well, what is your traditional name? What is your Aboriginal name?" So you just can't win. And I say, I don't know, because, you know, for various reasons, that was stripped away from me, like a lot of stuff. So, it's interesting. But you told me about that, the project you were talking about. It sounded, I wish they'd, you know, do a bit more in Queensland, but that's still one of those hard places.
I will open up to the audience very shortly, but before I do, I just want to throw a question to all three of you. I guess in terms of thinking about, as Lee put it, a bigger structural dismantling of racism, in terms of governments, because they are in a position to, you know, legislate policy change in this area that forces a cultural change. What are the sorts of considerations that you would like to see when it comes to specifically the workplace context? I mean, what sorts of conversations should governments be thinking about? I think in the UK, you know, they've announced, Theresa May's announced this ethnic, you know, companies are required to release their remuneration data across ethnicity, just to get a sense of just how wide that gap is between white Brits and non-white Brits. And I wonder, would something like that work in Australia, given the fact that we don't even collect racial data? Is that something we should be thinking about? You know, yeah, I'm just throwing it out to you, if there are things that you think governments should be considering.
I'll just have a go first. It's around, and the very important topic we haven't discussed is around leadership of this country with our leaders. I don't need to tell you what's happening at the moment, and how many times, you know, politicians and our prime ministers have just subjugated and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but people of other races as well. So I think the stuff around leadership in government is really important. And just a couple of little things I think that leaders should promote: the harmony, and they should celebrate the diversity and all the good that has with it, and that they must call out racism. And leaders should focus on the contributions that all citizens from all different colours, beliefs and backgrounds make to our society. And we have to really condemn anyone who casts aspersions or demonises any other ethnic race and us, because that has no place in this country, no place in the halls of government or in workplaces.
Speaking of leadership, do you think something like a quota system, in terms of the representation at that parliamentary level, because you talked about before, there's safety in numbers, so if we have greater representation, could that be something that could be enforced through quotas?
Sure. Look, just very briefly, I co-chair the National Congress of Australia's First People. We have a 50-50 gender representation, the only one in this country that calls out gender representation. Liz Broderick hailed it as a first and something that all ASIC companies should be doing. So I think and it has worked for us. You know, right across this country now, we see our organisations and communities where once, you know, men were very much in control, they think twice now about getting a woman to sit beside them. Doesn't happen everywhere, you know, culturally in the Torres Straits it's quite a bit different because it's a very patriarchal society. But now, you know, the gender works for us. And I've never seen so many Aboriginal women in charge of land councils as CEOs and doing the chair. So, you know, I think that has changed the focus in terms of our communities here. So gender quotas, very important.
Yin, what would you like to see change?
Well, I think there's been some good evidence recently from work by the Australian Human Rights Commission, for example, on cultural diversity in leadership in Australia. So we don't have the same sort of data framework that other countries have, like the UK or the US or New Zealand or Canada, but we still have some data, and it does clearly show, a lot of whiteness in leadership. A lot of white middle-class males
And so
run the country.
how do we go about changing that?
Well, we have to really start asking ourselves what the nature of the problem is. I mean, some people claim it's just a matter of time before the diversity of Australia is represented at the top, but we've been waiting decades for that matter of time to come. So, there has been some moves to try and institute gender quotas on boards, for example, as Jackie was talking about, and I think it's a matter of calling it out for what it is. The reason why there isn't that cultural diversity is because of systemic forms of racism, and we need to tackle it at all those levels that we've talked about, and in a way that brings as many people on board as possible. So even if we do have to sell the benefits of diversity.
Just playing devil's advocate, what if someone says, well, people should be appointed based on merit, like...
They do say that all the time. And I think we need to problematise the nature of what we think of as merit. It comes with our thinking. If you continue to think of everything as a matter of atomised individuals wandering around competing with each other, you're never going to understand the nature of the problem. And if you continue to ignore history, you're never going to understand the nature of it. People who talk about merit never seem worried about all the middle-class heterosexual white males who get things without any merit. They're worried about those very same people who miss out on something because someone else has a little bit of merit for a job. So look at the history, understand what is good for organisation. Merit is a matter of how teams within organisations work together, and those teams need diversity to do well. And you don't run a hospital full of doctors. You need more than doctors to run a hospital, and you need more than white middle-class males to run a society. That's simple.
And just briefly, Lee.
I have so many things to say on this, but I will try to be brief. You asked specifically about data collection. Yes to better data collection. Most of you have heard of the gender pay gap. How do we know if we have a racial pay gap if we don't even collect the data? You asked about quotas. Yes to quotas. Quotas are actually effective. In the countries in Scandinavia where they've introduced them, they show that having targets and being required to meet them is effective at increasing diversity in the workplace. Obviously, there's a massive education piece, education in public, in schools, in workplaces, but there's also 2 legislative reforms that I think are really important that we should talk. Before I get to the legislative reforms, can our political leaders stop scapegoating racial minorities for cheap political gain?
Yes.
And now onto the law reform that no one will find as interesting except for me. There's 2 really important legislative reform options. The first is to modernise and consolidate Australia's discrimination law protections to make it easier for people to actually bring complaints, to remove some of the barriers that stop people from actually being able to go to court and to access justice when they're discriminated against because of their racial background. And the final one is Australia is the only Western democracy in the world without a Charter of Human Rights, something that says in plain language that everyone knows and every child in school can learn. Everyone has the right to be treated equally and fairly, and everyone has the right to be free from discrimination, no matter where you come from, no matter who you love, no matter who you are. You have the right in this country to be free from racial discrimination, and it's about time that we introduced one of those charters.
Amazing. On that note, I will throw to the audience for some questions. I think there's a hand right at the back there. If you could just briefly introduce yourself.
Hey, my name is Guido Mello. Hey, Santilla.
Hi, Guido.
Professor Yin, Lee. But my question is for Jackie. Maybe I'm just not aware, but I never heard the expression stolen wages. And I do believe as an Afro-Brazilian, we have similarities on that story of wages stolen. But I found the term very interesting, and I really want to dig deep into, learn a bit more. If you know anything about it that we can research, and if you know the amount, or if there is an estimate on how much was stolen, and if there is any process for reparation.
Yeah, sure. Right across this country, most of the states have taken that up now. But from my end of the world, there's the best book I've read is around a woman called Ros Kidd, and she wrote about stolen wages on Queensland missions and reserves. Yin, I don't know that you've got something in your head about a reference or a text to that. But there's been a lot of stuff written lately. Yeah, there's a dearth, there's a whole heap of information out there. So thank you very much and good luck with your research too. Yeah.
Obrigado por sua pergunta. I think there is quite a bit, and there's some literature, and there's government inquiries of some sorts as well. We certainly do not have a handle on the full amount of stolen wages, and it's a problem that's occurred across the country. More needs to be done to really bring some justice to that situation, absolutely.
Any more questions?
Down the front.
I
Gentleman
think
at
there's
the
a
front.
question down at the front, yep.
Hi. One of the things that I find is a deep denial about racism and zero understanding about structural racism. And I find with there being no belief that they exist and no language to explain, I feel like this conversation gets at an impasse. Like, where do you get beyond no one believes it and or you don't have words to explain it to move forward? It seems like that's a point where this whole dialogue stops. And I'm asking, I guess, for some tools to unstop it.
Well, I think you do need to tailor the message and the communication and the dialogue that you're engaging with to your audience. And, everyone understands from a very young age fairness and justice. And they connect with that in some way in their life. And so it's about finding that connection. You don't have to use the R word, you can just talk about experiences that people have had, ways that you feel included or excluded, another very basic human concept. And take the conversation from there, and what we are about is making a better society for everybody. So I think you have to keep people in the conversation. Some of the dangers of diversity initiatives are leaving people behind, going on a journey where you've left large segments of your organisation behind, asking questions, worrying about their place, being anxious about what it means for them. Connect with their concerns, connect with their feelings of what a good organisation is and how they experience it and what they would like to continue to experience and how we can bring other people to have similar experiences as well.
Great. Any more questions? We've got a hand down here at the front.
Hi there. My name is Faida. I am an artist and aspiring actor, and I work in customer service and hospitality. I guess my question is in relationship to leadership in the arts specifically. I find that based on the fact that I work in, if not one of the most prominent theatre spaces in Melbourne, that is predominantly based on a subscriber-based funding, where a majority of their funding is based from what they get from their subscribers and donations, and I think about 8% from the government, and then a little bit of support from the universities that they're partnered with, I find that by being the only person of colour and being the only black queer person in that space, I, from the course of a year and a half, have been subjected to an array of racial discrimination, and not on the basis of it being conscious and it being that overt expression, but questions of where you're from, followed by, yes, I volunteered in Congo when I was, young, and what's your name? What does your name mean? And having that conversation, I did take further, and I had, conversations with my supervisors and my superiors, and talking about how, although those experiences weren't, your most extreme experience of what racism needs to be identified, I was met with this kind of conversation of, it's individualistic, it's not coming from a negative place, and okay, how do we even identify whether this is racist or not, based on the fact that they were circumstances that I had only experienced on my own, with no supervisor aware or close by to rectify, or, and I think that even when I had those conversations, there were moments when I would have staff near me that, again, were white and were uncomfortable and unknowing of how to deal with those situations. But I found that even if I looked at that situation between myself and my colleagues, there was a much larger issue, based on the fact that about 97% of our audience was middle-aged to elderly, middle-class to upper-class white people. And it was not just the people that were coming, it was the shows that were on stage. It was the people that were actually in the shows as well. It was the directors, it was the playwrights, it was back of house, it was everyone working in that space. And I found that I had a much more deeper conversation about the art space in general, in terms of not just Melbourne, but Australia. And I think when I think about leadership, that idea of not just having representation, having, 2 or 3 more black people working in the space, doesn't really make a difference, because when you continue to appropriate a specific kind of art that a company benefits from, based on the people that come and see, based on financial reasons, based on social reasons and political, nothing changes. So for me, it's like, is there a way where we can hold the art institution accountable, and is it enough to just have, diverse people in the space? Or is it having, diverse playwrights, having diverse people on stage, having diverse directors?
All right. I think we've got the context of your situation, but I think I might throw that to Lee, because she touched on the cumulative impact that those kinds of microaggressions have. But also, it's a very unique situation in that it is in a specific sector. But perhaps you could speak more broadly into that question around representation as well.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And I think the previous person who asked the question, when we said, sometimes it's hard to find that language to describe that issue, I think you really explained clearly, these are the words that we need to get out there about what this feels like. And I think what you've described, something that you said that was really struck a chord with me, is this sense of people feeling uncomfortable. I think if you go to an arts event and everyone on stage and everyone in the audience is white and the only people of colour are the people who are employed to serve food, you should feel uncomfortable. Like, you should look at a room like that and think, what is going on here? That this is normal? That, most people don't think that there is anything wrong with this in our society. In terms of what you asked about, how do we fix this? Like we said before, there is no single quick fix. Any person who says, well, what 3 things can I do tomorrow to fix this, will fail. These are fundamental, long-term issues that require change at every single level that we're thinking about. Yes, quotas are important. Yes, increased diversity in a non-tokenistic way is important, but so is, reflection, so is changing policies. There needs to be changes at every single level if we're serious about uprooting these beliefs and structures that have really been embedded over decades and decades and decades.
And we'll take one more final question.
Hi, Hi, my name is Sherry Rose, and thanks for your insights. I wanted to ask specifically as well around when we're talking about racism in the workplace, and then I guess from my experience as well, and I know that of others, sometimes I would like to kind of discuss the intergenerational gap between the understanding of racism and also how do we have then those conversations about our experiences going into a professional space with your parents, your family members, and particularly in intercultural and interracial family contexts. How can we have those, how do we have those conversations? Because I find it difficult at times.
Are you saying that if your parents' experience of racism in the workplace is different to your experience, how do
because of the intergenerational differences, but also because of cultural context as well?
Do you want to take that, Jackie?
Gosh, I'd be here for another half hour, to tell you the truth. Great question, though. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I often think about, my generation, my son, who's 33, and the way in which he has experienced racism within the workplace, and how we come to the conversations of how you stand up to it and what do you do. And I mean, without bragging, I had a bit of experience around that. So I generally would pass it on to him, and just stick up for yourself in the schoolyard. Kids come and bully you, you go straight back to them and look them in the eye, and you just do something about it. But look, generally I think those are conversations that always need to be had, because we're all part of this. Our family is for many of us the most important thing in our lives. So we learn by them, and we pass on the various shortcuts, I suppose, and the highs and lows and the joys of living, and the disappointments, and I think that's quite a continual thing. But I wanted to know, can I chuck that to you? Because
to me?
Yes, to answer. Because we said we're going to chuck it around here.
I don't have an answer for it, because I have my experiences of racism very different from my parents. Like, my parents just sort of think, oh, that's not an issue, just, Okay. So it's a very, very different conversation because of our own understanding of racism. I obviously spent a lot of time intellectualizing racism, whereas with my parents, their understanding is very much on that overt sort of level. Yeah. So it's a very complicated and difficult conversation.
It is, and we need another day to talk
Absolutely.
about it. It'd be lovely.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but please join me in thanking our wonderful panellists, Lee Carnie, Yin Paradies, and Jackie Huggins. And if you're not familiar with the Not Racist But series, it's going to be happening throughout the year. So we'll be exploring structural racism through various scenarios, and just keep an eye out on the Wheeler Centre website for the next date. Thank you very much.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.